Welcome to our 7th annual Free the Seeds event. I'm Gretchen Boyer. I'm the Executive Director of Land to Hand Montana, formerly Farm Hands Nourish the Flathead. We're so happy to have you here for our 2nd virtual event. Free the Seeds and Land to Hand is rooted in building a sustainable and resilient future through real seeds, real food, and real skills. Our mission is to build a strong community food system that fosters socially just ways of accessing food. Free the Seeds provides us an avenue to build that system. While this is a free event, it takes time and money to make it happen. If you'd like to support our efforts, please go to landtohand.org to donate, and we'll put a donate link in the chat. And you'll see that it says Free the Seeds as the donate link, and the funds will go directly to our Free the Seeds program. Finally, we want to thank this year's major sponsors, Box of Rain Organic Garden Center, who offers gardening supplies and classes in Kalispell. We will also link them in the chat. And Save Farmland, a new nonprofit based in Whitefish, working to preserve farmland. And finally, you, our amazing seed savers. This year, 75% of the seeds that we packaged and gave away were from local seed savers, which is what this Free the Seeds movement is all about. So we are so appreciative. And with that, we're going to introduce Shawn McDyre, who's going to do his mushroom cultivation at home and in the garden workshop with you all. Shawn's workshop will focus on small scale mushroom cultivation and methods for home and garden spaces. You will learn several low-tech methods for mushroom production, including log cultivation, pasteurized straw cultivation, and mushroom production in the garden using wood chips and straw. This class will briefly address more high-tech methods used by commercial growers, which can be adapted at home. Participants will learn the general life cycle of mushrooms and all the basics to begin producing mushrooms at home. Shawn is the owner and operator of Suntan Farms in Kalispell, Montana. He is a grower, a fungi fanatic, an engineer, and entrepreneur. Suntan Farms is a 6-acre gourmet mushroom and diversified vegetable farm focusing on selling mushrooms, vegetables, and mushroom value-added products to farmers markets, restaurants, and grocery stores throughout the valley. Shawn is passionate about growing fungi and all kinds and along with spreading the knowledge of how to do so with anyone willing to listen. And with that, we are so lucky to have Shawn with us. Shawn, take it away.
Thank you, Gretchen, and welcome everybody. It's really exciting to see just the number of people that are here this afternoon and interested in mushrooms. And looks like we have people from all over the country, and I think I even saw some from outside the United States. So I appreciate everyone's time to go through the workshop here that we have presented for you. And I'm going to share my presentation right now. And so the title here is Mushroom Cultivation for the Home and Garden. So I've been growing mushrooms for over 10 years now, and about 5 years commercially now through our farm business. But my journey to growing mushrooms and understanding mushrooms started out a lot like the methods that we're going to go through today that can be done on a small scale in the home and in the garden. And, you know, you can produce enough mushrooms to sustain your family, to just diversify your diet with, you know, all the health benefits that exist in mushrooms. And so to begin, we'll go over a little bit of the life cycle and biology of mushrooms, just so that everyone has kind of a brief knowledge to inform all the processes that we're going to talk about later. And I'll say right now that if there are any questions that are pertinent to what I'm discussing in the moment, feel free to ask, and I'll try to pause every so often to get some questions addressed so that we don't lose track of if someone thinks of something that's, you know, relevant to what I was just discussing or is worried about where to get materials. And then also towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to try to leave at least 20 minutes for a general Q&A, as I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions that'll pop up through the workshop. So a brief introduction to the mushroom life cycle is everything kind of begins and ends with the mushroom. You know, there's thousands of varieties of fungi in the world. Only a small part actually produce mushrooms, but mushrooms are in the fungi kingdom, which is a separate kingdom to itself. They're different than plants. They're actually more related to humans than they are to plants, but a lot of times for agricultural and sale purposes, they get lumped in with plants as part of produce, but they are unique to themselves. So the mushroom is the fruiting body of the fungi and the mycelium, and mushrooms spread spores in different ways. But spores are basically what you can think of as the seed. If you want to draw a correlation between growing plants and growing mushrooms, the seed is what begins everything. The seed is released, and then that germinates once it's attached and meets other spores in a a substrate that is conducive to mushroom growth. And then so you would form hyphae from there, and then that hyphae would turn into a much larger mycelial mat, whether it's in a substrate or whether it's in the soil. And you can think of the hyphae and the mycelium as basically the root system of the mushroom structure. And after something is completely colonized by the mushroom mycelium, then we see hyphal knots, which then turn into primordia, which are essentially baby mushrooms. And over a course of a week or so, that baby mushroom will then mature into a large, fully mature mushroom, and then it'll release spores and start the cycle all over again. So these are 5 steps that are critical to all mushroom cultivation, whether you're doing it, on a small scale at your garden, if it's a commercial farm. This is the basic life cycle that we use to imitate what happens in nature to grow out mycelium and then produce fruiting mushrooms. So substrate preparation and treatment, if necessary, that's going to be gathering up your materials that you plan to grow the mushrooms on. And then you're going to inoculate that materials with spawn. And we'll describe what spawn is in a few minutes here. Then there's going to be an incubation period where that mycelium then spreads throughout the material that you've inoculated. And as I mentioned with the life cycle, once that material is spread completely throughout the material and colonized completely, then you have fruit initiation, which is when, given the right conditions of humidity, temperature, and airflow, mushrooms will begin to form in a baby stage, and then you have maturation and then harvesting that follow that. So there's over 1.5 million species of fungi identified. A little over 10,000 of these produce mushrooms, so it's a very small percentage of fungi. Fungi is a very vast and understood kingdom. About 300 of these mushroom-producing fungi are actually considered a good edible mushroom. And then less than 50 of them have actually been grown at any kind of commercial scale. And only about 15 to maybe 20 now are actually actively produced commercially by farms and other people growing them for profit. And a little bit more on the biology of mushroom, just because we do get quite a few questions. People want to understand why you see mushrooms just growing out in the wild, and yet it's difficult to kind of force them to grow the way that you want. And so what we need to understand is that there's 3 main types of fungi that produce mushrooms. There's saprophytic mushrooms that decompose organic matter, typically lignin-based materials, which is the protein that's in wood-based substrates or cereal grains and straw. And so those are the ones that we're going to focus on today, mostly of what is generally commercially produced in mushroom cultivation for edible mushrooms. Then we also have mycorrhizal mushrooms that form complex relationships within the soil and companion plants. And so that's going to include species like the morel down here to the bottom, chanterelles, porcini, other things that you pick in the wild quite often. And the reason why they can't be commercially cultivated is because they have such complex relationships with the soil and the plants that they grow amongst that we can't really reproduce that outside of nature. And then lastly, there's a class of fungi, parasitic, which attack and steal nutrients from the host, eventually killing it. An example of that is honey mushroom, which is here in the top photo. Chicken in the woods is an example of that as well, where it'll actually attack the plant that it then feeds on, whereas saprophytic mushrooms are decomposing matter that's already dead, dead logs, dead trees fallen in the forest, things like that. So the general methods for cultivation at the home and the garden, and these are kind of going in order of low tech to simple and effort that you need to put in there down to the most kind of high tech and most effort. Hardwood log cultivation is the method shown here in the top photo with shiitake growing here on some logs. And that's a way of taking, a tree that is dead or is cut and just introducing the mycelium that you want to grow on it into it, differently than it would naturally in nature. You could grow oysters in nature when a tree falls in a forest, but we're going to take the process and try to manipulate it to grow what we want on it. And so the second method we'll discuss is straw or wood chip beds in the garden, or just somewhere a shady spot on your property. Manure or compost-based cultivation we'll touch on briefly. There's only a few species that can really be done with. That's another garden tech. Pasteurized straw in containers or bags is probably the best method for starting at home to ensure your highest level of success. And an example of that is down here. This is a pink oyster growing on a straw log. And then cultivation on oysters on other waste products, including seed hulls, corn stalks, coffee, banana, cardboard, paper products. That's kind of for fun and experimenting. You don't produce a ton of, actual substantial amounts of mushrooms on that, but it's something that's neat and I like to introduce to people, and something great for doing with experiments with kids as well to help them understand mushrooms. And then finally, supplemented sawdust substrate is the method that we use to produce mushrooms commercially. And we'll go over some of the methods that you can use at home to scale down what we do and have some success at home as a home grower. So we talked about spawn in our general 5 steps to mushroom cultivation. So what is spawn? Spawn is the form of mushroom mycelium, which can be easily mixed into a substrate for inoculation. Spawn comes in many forms, including plug, sawdust, grain, liquid culture, and even homemade varieties. And the production of most spawn requires lab or clean conditions, but simple spawn can be made at home from things such as cardboard, wood chips, grounds. And spawn should always be free of contaminants other than prepared substrate will be infected and never colonized. So to think of spawn as it's, essentially a seed. Again, we said before that spores are the seed, but spawn is basically a step up of a larger spore where you're taking something that's already grown the mycelium on it, and we're using that to then introduce to our new substrate to then grow out the mycelium and introduce that in the species that we want to then eventually grow mushrooms. So sources of commercial spawn, if anyone's interested. And to give a brief overview, there's different applications that we use different types of spawn for. Grain spawn is typically used for inoculating straw for oysters or supplemented sawdust substrates. Your sawdust spawn is used for doing your garden wood chip or straw beds. And then your plug spawn is used when you're doing log cultivation, and then you're drilling holes and then plugging those holes with plug spawn. And you'll see some photos of that later. Jason, I'll check in now to see if there's any questions that have popped up in the meantime.
No, there are currently no questions right now.
Okay. So one of the things that makes growing mushrooms a lot more difficult than other methods of growing food, whether it's, plant growth or just growing vegetables in your garden, basically everything out there in the air is full of mold spores, bacteria, and wants to invade the substrate that we're using to produce mushrooms in a way that's going to compete with the mycelium that we're going to introduce in the form of spawn. So there's 6 ways that this happens, and this is called the 6 vectors of contamination, where you have the cultivator yourself. As I mentioned, the air is full of mold, mildew, and other fungi spores that are just floating around. And if you've ever seen the experiment, it's kind of cool where you can take a petri dish full of agar, leave it on any surface in your home or anywhere else, and come back a few days later, and there's all different varieties of mold, mildew, bacteria growing on there. It's just all throughout the air. And so all that is competing to decompose the same materials that we're trying to use for mushroom cultivation. And so you yourself are carrying spores on you, And so, for example, in our commercial grow, we typically wear some PPE, whether it's a hazmat suit or something like that when we work in the lab, and that removes that risk from the process. Then your substrate in general is going to have things in there that are going to want to compete with the mushroom mycelium, your tools as well. The spawn, it's really hard when you have spawn to know that it is free of contaminants until you've grown it out on your substrate and you see things happening. Airborne microorganisms, as I said, if you're not working in a clean environment with filtered air, there's going to be contaminants in there. And then insects, and that's more of a risk for whenever you're growing actual mushrooms actively, fungus gnats, other fruit flies, they're amazingly attracted to growing mycelium. It puts out CO2 and other ethers that just attract bugs like crazy, and then they touch your substrate and then can future contaminate that. And for example, this is a bag that I'm not ashamed to admit came from our farm, but I'll say it was a couple years ago before we got better practices. But this still happens to the best of cultivators, where that green ring at the top there is a mold known as trichoderma. It's probably the most common mold that you'll see that'll pop up in competition with your mycelium. And then the bottom of the picture there, where you can see a clear line where there's white mycelium, and then below that is just the natural wood sawdust color. That's a sign of bacterial contamination, that you see that where it gets too soggy, it gets too hot, too cold, and bacteria just takes over the process. And it'll kind of create this clear division where the mycelium is still healthy above, but everything below there is kind of gone haywire. And so the first method that we showed in the previous slide was using hardwood log cultivation. And so ideally for this process, we're going to use fresh hardwood logs, which are less than 2 months from cutting. They should be cut either just starting to die or live, not fully standing dead, where at that point something has already gotten in there to kind of compete with the log. Logs should be 3 to 4 foot in length and 6 to 8 inches in diameter. Fast decomposing species like alder, poplar, cottonwood, and willow, which are ones that we have in pretty good abundance here in the Flathead, are best, as they kind of give you a leg up against the competition. And then it's best to inoculate them in early spring and expect hopefully a first flush in fall. Sometimes the process can take anywhere from 6 to 12 months, and it depends on the size of the log that you're using, the species. And so the larger the log, the longer that the incubation and colonization process is going to take. And what we're showing here in the image to the right is the pattern that basically you're going to drill holes of a diameter slightly large than the peg that you have, the plug spawn, to inoculate in a grid like this, where you have every 6 inches kind of staggered and then 6 inches around the log. And so here's a list of some of the log species that are ideal for individual species of mushrooms that you want to grow. This is a resource from Paul Stamets, Mycelium Running. So I'll give that a minute for everyone to kind of absorb that and write down if you need to.
Hey, Shawn, there's a couple questions that might be worth answering.
Sure.
Yes, so Benjamin wants to know, how do you source your local hardwoods?
So we cannot get fuel pellets that are hardwood around here. What we actually do is we buy. So if you're talking about logs, the best thing to do is to find somebody that cuts, firewood, and say, hey, can you look out for some cottonwood or some aspen or something like that for me? And, I'll pay the price of, firewood for it. And they'll usually cut it in lengths and size that you'll need for cultivation. You can check out resources like Craigslist too. A lot of times in towns, like in city limits, people have hardwood trees growing in the yards, and sometimes they'll take them down. They'll say, hey, we've got this log cut down for anyone to take if you just come and take it. But it's a little harder here in Montana, where we don't have the diversity of hardwood species that a lot of other places have, like oak and maple and things like that. So you got to kind of either know where to look for it. And like I said, just try to make friends with someone that cuts firewood, or you can even reach out to like a tree service company, someone that does tree pruning, or like local utility companies that if they're trimming trees for power line cleanup or anything like that, sometimes they might have resources for that as well.
Can you use birch wood?
Yes. Anything that is not a coniferous tree. So the groups of trees you don't want to use are your pines, your firs, and things like that, because there's resins that are in the wood that inhibit mushroom mycelium growth. And that's why they are used for building materials, is because they're kind of antifungal as it is. All right, so we'll move.
Really quick, Shawn, one more. Could you go back to the previous slide, the best wood for types of mushrooms? Great.
And this presentation should be available as a resource. If there's anything in here that people miss out on, we'll make the PowerPoint available to everyone here. So the general steps for cultivation is we're going to cut our hardwood and we're going to dry it for 2 to 6 weeks so that it's not soaking wet. We're going to drill and cut inoculation points like we showed in the previous slide right there. And then we're going to, and as you can see in this photo, there's an example of someone using a drill bit to draw, to make that kind of grid pattern. And we're going to inoculate those holes with plug sawn, or you can use sawdust. They sell tools that you can take sawdust substrate or sawdust spawn and kind of pack it into those holes as well. If you don't buy plug spawn and you want to make your own. And then once that's done, we're going to seal up. All right. So back to the slide we were just on. As I mentioned, you're going to wait until that white mycelium is crept all the way into the center of the log to begin to think about then trying to fruit. I mean, the low-tech way is to just let it happen naturally in the spring or fall when you have more precipitation and it's more humid out. It's going to take relative humidity above 75% for an extended period to get things to naturally fruit, but you can also mist them with a hose and just keep them in an area covered by a tarp or shade cloth or something like that to increase the humidity. And you'll want that for incubation then for fruiting as well. And so if you do any log cultivation, you don't see that white mycelium spreading throughout the end of the log, you probably have something going on where you have contamination or mycelium just didn't take off. And so another method that's low tech and similar, and if you don't want to go through the effort of drilling all those holes for plug spawn and inoculating all those points, which can be very tedious, you can do a stump or totem method, which is then just cutting the same logs, and you can do this with even larger diameter logs, like up to 2 feet in diameter, and cutting them in like 6 to 12-inch thicknesses, and then placing your sawdust spawn in the areas in between the cuts like that, and then the mycelium will spread. The only thing about this process is obviously going to take longer because you have a bigger substrate and fewer inoculation points, so it's going to take a bit longer, and you'll want to use faster decomposing species like oyster and lion's mane. And then when you do that, you can cover those stumps or totems with a trash bag or something to keep the humidity in, and that'll help things hopefully move along a little bit faster. And so we'll move on here to straw wood chip beds. Is there any other questions related to log methods before we move on to there?
Yeah, so Amanda would like to know, will the species of wood the mushrooms are grown on affect the flavor?
I can't say that there's any real evidence of that. I would say, if you were growing something that does, there are certain species that grow on pine and Doug fir, like chicken of the woods, and a couple species of Hericium. So I would imagine that some of that taste might get through. But what happens when mushrooms grow is they convert all the lignin, which is the wood-based material, into a completely different protein, and they break down things that are in the substrate into unrecognizable components. So there's very little chance that the actual species will have any effect on the flavor, because everything's being changed at basically a cellular level into a completely different substance.
Okay, Richard from Hawaii would like to know, can you use avocado, mango, or kiwi wood logs?
I'm sure you could. You'd have to look at what people in those climates have used them for. They probably wouldn't grow shiitake or species that don't have those plants as native, but there's a good resource. Like I said, I pulled that list from Paul Stamets' book, Mycelium Running. And there's a few other books there that I will mention at the end of the spreadsheet that might have resources for people in more tropical climates, dealing with different types of hardwood species. But I would say it would probably be more so a mushroom that's native to that area, like a type of oyster probably would, for sure.
Okay, and then I have one more. So Mark Robbie would like to know, when drying 2 to 6 weeks, do you stack, keep off the ground, or cover with anything?
Definitely keep off the ground, because laying them on the ground will just further the chance that some other kind of fungus or bacteria is going to get in there. You can stack them. You could put them on a pallet as they're drying. Like you kind of want to just dry them out to the point where they don't have active like sap run still in there, and it'll make it easier to drill into. There's not necessarily like a percent moisture that you need. It's just you want to let anything die off that was already kind of working on the surface there, and just make it easier to drill into, but definitely keep off the ground.
Okay, so I know I said one more question, but I have I have one question that was upvoted. What temp do you start to inoculate in the flathead?
You can inoculate at any temperature. The warmer, the faster the colonization is going to happen. I would say, if you start in late March, you're usually pretty safe that we're not getting like a -15. Mushroom mycelium is stable down to like -20 in most cases. It's, the stronger the mycelium is, the more chance it's not going to be damaged by the cold. But you can do it technically right now, and it'll just take a little bit longer to get a spawn run. All right, so we'll move on to straw or wood chip bed cultivation. And so this is probably next to, this is the least amount of labor that you're going to put in, but also has the lowest probability of success, unless you use certain species. So it's a low-tech method without any treatment of your substrate. It can be done hardwood chips. Again, it needs to be hardwood. Can't use pine chips because they're still freshly cut and they have those resins in there. And then we can also use straw, and straw and wood chips will apply to the species that we'll talk about here. But again, this is going to be, you're doing this in an area in your garden where it's going to be in contact with soil. So there's going to be a pretty high risk of contamination. So we're going to stick to oyster or king stropharia, also called wine cap, for this type of cultivation. So this is your general process. Is you're going to, get an area and like a bag of spawn, like a 5-pound bag of sawdust spawn, which we should use sawdust because it has the least amount of nutrients in it. If we use grain spawn, then insects and critters are going to want to steal the spawn out of the area. And like a 4x8 area is ideal for doing a wood chip bed or a straw bed. And that should be able to spread 1 5-pound bag of spawn across that area to inoculate it sufficiently. So we'll prepare the space by removing, any dead or decomposing organic matter, and then spread a base layer of straw or wood chips, and then start sprinkling our spawn on top. And then we're going to layer that in lifts of like every 1 to 2 inches, and then just keep stacking it like lasagna, like you can see kind of in this previous picture here. And then give it a good soak once you've built the whole bed, and then your top layer is going to be your straw or your wood chips again, so that none of your spawn is exposed. And then, you can put cardboard or a tarp or just an extra layer of straw on top to keep it from drying out. And then you're going to want to, maybe irrigate it every week or so if it's during the drier period. If you're getting natural rainfall in there, it should be adequate to keep it. So something else, we've done this with pretty good success on our farm, where we actually lay hardwood chips in the walkways between our garden, like our crop rows. And so we'll grow King Stropharia on hardwood chips in between like rows of greens or arugula or squash or stuff like that. And we're going on like 3 years from the first bed that we inoculated, and it's still producing, you know, probably 10 to 20 pounds of wine caps every year. And so oysters on pasteurized straw is the method that I recommend the highest for anyone getting in that wants the highest percentage of success and doesn't, you know, want to be frustrated and feel like they keep failing at the same thing. You're adding some tech to the process that's going to ensure that you're killing off some of the competition species that want to go after the mushroom mycelium and the substrate. And so the general process consists of pasteurization of cereal straws. So cereal straws is just the straw from any cereal grain crop, including wheat, barley, oats, rye, you know, anything you can find in your area, sorghum, millet, anything like that that's grown. You take the, you know, what's left after the crop has been harvested, and that's straw. And so there's very little nutrient in it. It's basically just a woody material that's left. And so we're going to put that in some kind of suitable container after it's been pasteurized, incubate, and then fruit. And, you know, we're choosing oysters because they're the most aggressive strain and grow on the widest array of substrates so that they are recommended for straw cultivation. There's not much success that you can have with any other species on straw other than the King Stropharia that we mentioned. But the way that we're going to be doing this process, it's going to be meant that you could bring it indoors, you could do it in a smaller space, and have more control over temperature, humidity, and things like that. So pasteurization is going to be achieved by holding the substrate at 170 degrees for 2 hours, or cold lime pasteurization using hydrated lime soaking for 16 to 18 hours. And so this is hot water pasteurization. You know, what you want to do to increase your success is to chop the straw up into 1 to 2 inch pieces just to make it a more uniform substrate. You can go without the process of chopping. However, the more air voids that you have in your substrate, the straw, the more work the mycelium has to do to get through, and so the lower yield you're going to have. So just chopping the straw will basically double your yields of what you get off of your straw logs. And so this is an example of what a lot of people do to pasteurize, hot water pasteurize the straw, is get a 55-gallon drum. You can do a bucket, a trash can, and the drum is great because you can put a heat source below, which is, you know, like a burner with a propane tank, and then you can maintain that even heat of 170 degrees for 2 hours. I've had success with just doing like getting a cooler or something somewhat insulated and just putting 200-degree water in there and then introducing the straw. And then that introduction of your substrate is going to drop your temperature, but hopefully it stays above 170 degrees for at least 2 hours. And then you've achieved your goal without having to go through the effort of, you know, maintaining a flame beneath it and monitoring the temperature. And so we want to hold that for 2 hours, and we don't want to exceed 190 degrees for an extended period of time, because that's going to encourage a certain type of bacteria that likes high temperatures that'll then basically ruin all the effort that you just went through to trying to destroy the microbes that are in the straw. So after we've soaked it for 2 hours, we're going to drain the straw and let it dry to saturated surface dry condition, which is basically when you can grab a handful of it and try to wring it out and only a few drops come out of it. It's not actively like leaking still any kind of moisture from it. And then we're going to place that straw in a container, such as a bag, a bin, a plastic tube, bucket, anything like that that can hold and that we can put some kind of ventilation holes into to introduce gas exchange. Because eventually this container is going to be our incubating container and then our fruiting container as well. And then we're going to introduce spawn mixed in at 1 to 10% of the dry weight of the substrate. So you're going to try to weigh out or have an approximate idea of how much substrate straw that you're using dry before you soak it. And then you're going to take 1 to 10% of that, depending on how conservative you want to be, of that weight as spawn to introduce to that whole bulk material there. And as I mentioned, we're going to put air holes in the container to allow gas exchange. And then we're going to incubate the containers for 4 weeks, usually around 55 to 75. And again, with the process, the lower the temperature that we incubate at, the slower the incubation process is going to happen. The faster we raise it is, going to speed up to maybe as little as 2 to 3 weeks, but we don't want to really exceed 75 degrees in incubation, because then some bad things can happen bacterially as well. And so oyster mushrooms on cold lime pasteurization. This is a different low-tech method if you don't want to go through having a burner and you don't want to deal with having to lift the heavy straw out of a big drum that's been soaking in. There is a method you can do by soaking the straw in a lime bath for 16 to 18 hours at a pH above 12. And so to do that, you're going to use low magnesium lime. You need to make sure that there is not a high magnesium percent that's above, I believe, 2%. Otherwise, that will inhibit mycelial growth. And there's, you can go to your local farm supply store, and they'll usually have multiple sources of lime, and then just look on the ingredients list and make sure that the magnesium percent is, below 2%. Hopefully. And so we're going to soak that straw and drain it, and then put it into the same type of containers that we had put in for the hot water pasteurization. For example, this is an example of using a bucket where you place the straw in, then you inoculate with the grain spawn, and then you're drilling these holes, as it can be seen right here, which allow air exchange where the CO2 forms and air, oxygens come in. And that eventually is going to be the spot where your mushrooms form as well. So it's serving a dual purpose. And so when we're ready to fruit after the 4-week incubation period, then we're going to introduce to a humid environment for fruiting. And the kind of key strategy there is you want above 85% humidity for an extended period of time to start fruiting. And once the mushroom pins, which we call them, or the baby mushrooms, have formed, then mushrooms have a lot more tolerance for humidity, where you can let it drop as low as 70 to 75, but you don't want to keep it there too long. You ideally want to keep it above 80% if possible during the whole process of fruiting, but you can vary it a little bit without losing everything. That beginning stage where they just start to pin is the most critical to keep your humidity up. And so just the science behind this process is that it's a high pH environment that allows the mycelium to outcompete any contaminants that are in the substrate. So it's not true pasteurization where there is actual bad bacteria and fungi in there, but we're giving the mycelium a leg up, and hopefully it outcompetes. And that's why keeping it in the right incubation parameters is key to make sure that. And again, we're doing this pretty much exclusively for oyster mushrooms, which are the most forgiving and the most aggressive that you can have kind of the most success with. And so this is a photo of myself. Here I'm using what they call lay flat plastic tubing, which they sell in rolls, and you can cut to length and make basically a synthetic mushroom log out of straw. And then you kind of just mix the spawn throughout the straw here, which I've laid out on a table with some lead fabric beneath it to help it drain. And then I would just sprinkle my grain spawn over top of that, and then gradually pack it as dense as I can get into these cylinders. Or here's an example where we've used just Rubbermaid containers in the past. And this is actually one that I fruited for over 3 years and produced over 10 pounds of mushrooms off of just that one bin, where, at the beginning, I just packed the straw loose in layers, and then I just sprinkled spawn in intermittently as I was packing different 2-inch layers, put the lid on, drilled some holes, and kept it in a humid area in one of our greenhouses. And 4 weeks later, we had big, beautiful, I think those were elm oyster mushrooms popping all over the sides of that bin. So I'll pause now. Is there any questions that have popped up, Jason?
Yes, so TK would like to know if you have mushrooms growing on your own in the garden beds, should we start a bed right away or utilize that area as good for mushrooms?
So if you have mushrooms growing there, that means that that mycelium is in there, and you're not going to be able to introduce other mycelium as well, because unless the mushrooms that you're introducing are eating something different, that mushroom has already consumed most of the food source that your mushroom would want to eat. And if you introduce two species to one container, one's going to win, and only that one type of mushroom will produce, and you've already have one there that's kind of winning and doing well. So if you have an area, you would want to scrape off, you know, maybe the first 2 inches of soil and then put down like cardboard on top of there, so that you're creating a barrier between the other mycelium that might be there and then the new mycelium.
Amy would like to know, do these beds need protection from deer?
Deer aren't as interested in mycelium. Deer will definitely eat your mushrooms once they're fruiting. Deer do like mushrooms. But I mean, you could do it just simply with like row cover or, you know, shade cloth. It doesn't need to be fully fenced. You can find other ways to probably keep the deer out. They're not going to necessarily go digging for it. But if they see mushrooms popping up, they eat our wine caps all the time in the garden spots. Yeah.
One user would like to know, soup mushrooms grown on wheat straws, is it safe for celiacs?
Yes. So as I said before, with the question about the taste of different species, when mushrooms break down a substrate, they completely change the cellular level, and they remove proteins and break them down in much simpler proteins. The gluten would not come through into the mushrooms, nor would anything else. You know, mushrooms are gluten-free regardless of what they're grown on. I mean, the only question then would be is if you have a severe wheat allergy and, you know, you were handling the wheat straw at some point, but then I would just say avoid, you know, so oat straw does not have any gluten, you know, oat does not have any gluten in it. There's other non-gluten based grains that you could use for straw if that's a concern.
Okay. And are mushrooms grown on any straw that's not certified non-GMO would produce mushrooms that are then technically GMO?
So I'm guessing the question there is that, you know, and this goes back again to the fact. So I'm not advocating for doing this, but if you took the most pesticide laden straw and grew oysters on it, and you tested those oyster mushrooms after, anything bad that was on that straw is broken down. Every chemical. The only thing that does not break down in the process of mushroom cultivation is heavy metals. And mushrooms can be accumulators of heavy metals, but that's a lot less common in cereal straws. But any concern about non-GMO, GMO, or sprayed straw, like obviously it would be better to be able to find a source of organic straw to know that it was a good, healthy plant. It'll probably produce better mushrooms. But if that's all you have access to and you know that someone sprayed something, it is not going to pass any of that chemical residue through to the mushrooms.
Okay. And I have one more. Sarah would like to know about how many 5-gallon buckets will 5 pounds of oyster mycelium on substrate make?
So you would probably go at a rate of like a 5-pound bag of grain spawn would inoculate safely. I'd say anywhere between 5 to 8 buckets of packed straw, depending on how heavy of a rate you want to go. You could do as little as 5, you can do as much as 8. And that would be a safe bet of you've got enough mycelium. And then each one of those 5-gallon buckets, there's a thing called biological efficiency when you're measuring, you know, the weight of the substrate that goes in. You know, we said before we were going to weigh the dry material before going into the soaking process to know how much spawn we're going to use. And we're also going to kind of check that as well, because biological efficiency is the amount of dry material that we then get that converts to fresh mushroom weight. And we should get 100% biological efficiency, meaning 100% of the dry weight that goes in comes out as fresh mushrooms. And so for a 5-gallon bucket, that's, you know, probably somewhere around 4 to 5 pounds of dry material. So about 4 to 5 pounds of fresh mushrooms.
Lose them again.
Yeah, we lost one again.
Happen again. Nothing popped up that time. It still says I'm sharing.
Okay. Can you hear him?
Okay. So the next subject we'll discuss briefly is cultivating mushrooms on compost. And this only works for a few species, including agaricus species, which are related to white button, cremini, and portobello mushrooms. And you can do this with oyster as well. We actually use our spent mushroom substrate in our tunnels now for fertilizer and for compost. And if you introduce spent substrate or mycelium in general, you will see oyster mushrooms popping up. It's a lot less of a controlled environment where you're just kind of getting what you get. And that's kind of how this goes, where, you know, more of the reason to do this is to integrate fungi more into your garden, where you're getting that kind of soil health benefit by growing something in conjunction with your plants that hopefully helps your plants. And then maybe you get a reward out of it in the form of mushrooms. And we can use this for almond agaricus, which grows on compost almost exclusively. And like we said, it's more for the symbiotic relationship with the soil. Expect less yields, maybe even none. So if that's what you're really going for is cultivating mushrooms, this probably isn't the method to focus on. And another one we'll just touch on briefly is oyster mushrooms on everyday waste products. And as we mentioned, oysters will decompose almost any waste product that's cellulose or lignin based. And so that's anything that has like a fibrous carbon-based kind of woody substrate to it. And that's anything from coffee grounds, paper waste, cardboard, jeans, other yard waste like leaf litter, straw we've already gone through. And we can grow them as an experiment as well on waste products like cardboard, because it's going to grow very rapidly on cardboard, and we can use that cardboard as spawn later on for other mushroom bed cultivation projects. Like if we're doing an oyster wood chip bed or an oyster straw bed, we can use the cardboard kind of shredded up to then introduce as spawn that has very little nutrient content, and we didn't spend a lot of money or effort on, but it produces something that we can use to just then spread the mushroom mycelium throughout our garden spaces. And another thing to briefly touch on, we've kind of addressed this already, of that oyster mycelium in particular breaks down some of the most hazardous chemicals known to man. And so if you have any issues of over nitrated or other high levels of chemical in your garden soil, we can use oyster mycelium to remediate that soil, and it will break down and not just pull out, but actually destroy the chemicals, the excess of nitrogen. We've done that a few times where we've given spent blocks to people that know that they got a batch of compost that had too much nitrogen in it. And when you introduce the spent block substrate compost, it sucks out all the excess nitrogen immediately, and the plants look better, usually within a week. And so I'll see if there's any questions. This is the last kind of method that we'll go through and the most intensive.
Yes. So Shawn, Maggie would like to know: do the mushrooms pop out of the holes you drilled in the container?
Yes. So that's going to be, serving a dual purpose for air exchange. Like I said, we need to make sure that the mushroom container doesn't build up too much CO2. And so drilling holes, every 12 inches or so in the bucket or whatever the container is going to allow the CO2 to exit and the fresh oxygen to come in. But it's also going to serve to then be the point where once we get to the stage where we're ready to fruit the mushrooms, one of the things that's needed to fruit mushrooms, we talked about humidity, we talked about temperature, but the other thing that's needed is fresh air exchange to start the initiating of fruiting. And so those holes are going to provide that fresh air exchange that's going to then start to form the mushroom pins out of those holes. Yes.
Okay. And Maggie would also like to know, can you put more than one type of oyster in the same bed, like pink and blue?
You can do that, and they will basically, like if you're doing it in a bed, it would work okay, where basically what would happen would be one species would consume X%, the other species would consume another percent, and then because they can create like a hard line in the substrate, they'll just fruit in their own areas. But if you did it in a container, then you'd have an issue of one would just basically win out over the other one.
Okay, and I have another question. Cheryl would like to know, how do you keep the humidity above 75%?
So it's obviously much more difficult if you're doing everything outdoors. That's where you're then left to just, whenever, like, spring is a time to fruit them well. When that, even here we have above 80% relative humidity for much of March, April, May, and then fall is very wet as well. But if you have the ability to bring the mushrooms indoors, then you can, there's already somewhat of a microclimate formed by your container. And so as long as your ambient humidity is not less than, say, 40%, you're not losing any humidity from your container. But the other thing you can do is just set up a humidifier somewhere near the incubating mushrooms, and then just let that increase the ambient humidity. When we started out growing, my wife was not very happy with me, but we had a whole room of our house that was dedicated to mushrooms, and the closet, because it was dark and I could keep the door kind of open to a certain extent to allow enough but not too much light and air exchange, then I just put a humidifier in there near it. Like even one of the small diffusers that a lot of people have for essential oils will be enough to increase the humidity around the incubating. And then you can also fruit in that condition as well.
Amanda would like to know, can additional substrate be added to a container after a few flushes to continue fruiting?
You can do that. The only issue is so once we've reached the end of incubation and the substrate is fully colonized, that's basically when it's the safest and most stable, and that that the mycelium has created an environment where there is no bacteria or competitors. As you fruit, the substrate continues to get more introduction of contaminants and bacteria and mold. And that's from like when you pick the mushrooms off of whatever container that you're using, like whatever's left that you don't pull off of the substrate, that's going to be an attractant for mold and bacteria and insects. And so every minute past when the mushrooms start fruiting, they're getting more and more kind of dirty and have a higher risk of contamination. So you can do that, especially like if you're doing an outdoor bed and you want to just keep adding wood chips or adding straw to a bed that already exists. Yeah, eventually that mycelium is going to take that up and use it as an additional food source to keep fruiting. And you can kind of do that in perpetuity where you can just keep adding wood chips or straw. I would say I wouldn't recommend doing it for pasteurized straw, because that's against the purpose of what we're trying to do, is to create as clean of an environment as possible.
Okay, I have one more question, and we will get to everyone else's questions later. So Hillary would like to know, do mushrooms need to be protected from grasshoppers?
I've not seen any evidence of grasshoppers feeding on mycelium. They tend to like fresh plant matter, so I would say they might go after mushrooms. But there's also, I mean, if you have a damp area where you're keeping mushrooms, that's not the environment that grasshoppers like. Grasshoppers like bone dry, tall grass and things like that. So I would say if you keep it humid, that's a way that on our farm we try to keep down grasshoppers, as they don't like humid environments. They tend to prefer dry, hot environments. They might go after mushrooms just growing out in the open, but they shouldn't be an issue for mycelium growing out. All right, so we'll cover one more topic here, which is supplemented sawdust substrate. And as I mentioned in the very beginning, so this is the method essentially that we use to grow all of our mushroom species. And the reason that we do that is because it's the most predictable. the most reliable and the most kind of way where we know a system where we produce this much every week and we know we're getting this much mushrooms and the yields are great. Everything's in a controlled environment. And so what we're doing is creating a mixture of sawdust and supplement that creates a nutrient dense mixture, but then requires sterilization. So the main thing different about this process is there's going to be enough nutrient in this mixture that just pasteurizing is not adequate. We need almost full sterilization of the material. And we do that through pressure cooking. And so this is a picture of some mushroom bags and a pressure cooker. And it doesn't need to be, you know, like this is an all-American, which is a very expensive model of pressure cooker. It can be a Presto, like 16 quart, 20 quart, anything like that. We have a Presto, I think 20 quart pressure cooker that I can fit 4 5-pound bags of substrate into. And so I can inoculate that when I'm doing experiments and doing like a small batch. And I can fit 4 bags in there that then we sterilize and then inoculate with grain spawn in the same way that we did for the pasteurized straw method. The main difference here is we have a very dense structured substrate that can be grown in a very much smaller space and in a lot higher control of our environment so that we produce better results. And so the 2 options that you have for your substrate is what's called master's mix. And so that's a 50-50 mixture of hardwood or fir sawdust and 50% soy hulls. And so this is the only instance where you can use Doug fir or pine. And, you know, up until a few years ago, the kind of gospel was that you can only use hardwood species to grow these types of mushrooms that we grow. And that was based off of a few books that were published, you know, a little over a decade ago and just not enough evidence. Whereas lately, you know, our farm included, we grow 90% of our species on Doug fir. And we use fuel pellets that are used for pellet stoves. So that process of pulverizing and then pelletizing the sawdust removes most of the resins from the fir that prevent it in its natural state from growing mycelium. And so we have not noticed really any difference between, we used to use alder, red alder for growing most of our species. And that's something that you can occasionally get in fuel pellet form or fresh sawdust form. But we use Doug fir for most of our species. And so you can use that for this technology. The other mix that you're going to use is 80%, 20%, which is 80% fuel pellet or sawdust, and then 20% of wheat bran, rice bran, or alfalfa pellets. There's other supplements that you can use. These are the 3 that we recommend as they're the most readily available and have the most kind of evidence behind them of success in this type of cultivation. And so when we do this, these bags are an autoclavable filter patch bag that can be bought at multiple locations. There's one place online called Myers Mushrooms that sells these bags in small quantities, you know, for everyday growers and large quantities for commercial growers. There's Mushroom Media online, which sells these bags. And also you can buy a pre-made master's mix, which is your 50-50 mix, or you can buy a pre-made 80-20 mix of bags. They have free shipping. It's not as cheap as buying the individual components itself, but that is a source for people that are looking to try this method out. And so this is the general process. Is we're going to hydrate our mixed substrate to 60% moisture content, compensating for the natural moisture that's in whatever material you're using. So if it's a fuel pellet, there's probably 4 to 5% natural moisture in there. So you're going to dial back 4 to 5% off of the amount of water that you add. And then your supplement should be in the same kind of moisture content. And so we're going to mix the substrate together to 50-50 or 80-20, and then we're going to hydrate it, or we can put the dry ingredients into the bag and then hydrate it by pouring the water into the bag. And then we're going to sterilize those bags once they've hydrated, and we're going to fold them up, and then we're going to put them into a pressure cooker for 1.5, ideally 2 hours at 10 psi. So next, we're going to allow the blocks to cool to room temperature in the sterilizer, not opening the sterilizer, because once we crack the seal of the vacuum, then that's just going to suck in dirty air. And so about 24 hours is always safe to say that they are cooled down to a temperature. You know, we don't want to introduce mushroom mycelium to something that's above 90 degrees Fahrenheit. If we do that, we kill the mycelium. So we want to let it cool down adequately to below 90 degrees, ideally less than 80 degrees. And then in a sanitary environment, we're going to inoculate the blocks with grain spawn. And you're going to use about a half cup of spawn per every 5-pound bag of substrate that you're inoculating. And then you're going to seal the bag up, and you can use an impulse sealer, a food saver, or something like that. And then just seal the top of the bag. And then we're going to let that incubate at the same temperature range, the 55 to 75 range that we use for a pasteurized straw, until the bag is fully colonized and you can see that white mass of mycelium spread throughout the entire bag. And then at that point, we'll introduce to the fruiting environment. And so this slide is about the ideal environment for fruiting. We've already discussed some of these parameters, and this applies not just to the last technology we mentioned of supplemented sawdust, but any environment where you're trying to fruit mushrooms. To initiate pinning, once the bag is fully colonized, we're going to cut some kind of hole. If you've already put holes into your container for incubation, you don't need to do that. This is more for the autoclavable bags, and then put into a humid environment at 88% minimum relative humidity. Humidity can vary once fruits start to form, but should not dip below 70%. Dappled sunlight, any level of artificial light is adequate to fruit mushrooms. Without any form of light, mushrooms will get leggy, just as plants do when they don't have enough sunlight, but any amount of light, artificial, is adequate to fruit and grow mushrooms. And then most species prefer temperature range of 55 to 70. Growth becomes more rapid as the temperature goes up and slows down more as the temperature goes down. We keep our grow rooms between 50 and 55 as much as we can, and that seems to be the best temperature for mushroom maturation and producing the highest quality yields. And so here's some examples. This picture on the left is a grow bag that we had tested out for selling grow at home kits. And that's blue oyster just sitting on our countertop in our home. And on the right there, if you want to get a little more high tech, you can create basically, like I said, the benefit to the supplemented sawdust substrate bags is you can grow a lot in a little space and create a little bit more of a professional setup, where this is just a humidifier piped into a mini greenhouse with the bags placed in there, and then there's some ventilation kind of happening all around there. And just to wrap everything up, as I said, we do things at a commercial scale, and this last example was a way that you can do that at a scaled down rate. However, people at home aren't going to have the clean environment that we have of a HEPA filtered lab, where we do most of our inoculation to prevent contamination. But a few ways that you can work clean without a lab is 2 examples here. The goal is to avoid exposure to airborne contaminants as much as possible. And so the still air box, which is the picture up here, is just basically a Rubbermaid bin upside down with 2 holes in it that you can put your hands in with gloves, and then you would spray down the interior of the surface with isopropyl alcohol to sterilize everything in there. And then the lack of incoming air is going to really reduce the amount of contaminants that can be introduced while you're working within the bin. And you could do this like you put your bags in the bin, have your grain spawn in there already, and then kind of work in the bin. Once everything is kind of introduced, fold them down and then seal everything. Or if you were doing any work with spawn, this is a good environment. And the bottom here is referred to as a glove box, and it's just a slightly improved version where you're fitting the gloves to the holes so that there is 0 air exchange within the box. And so that air inside that box, if you spray isopropyl alcohol, you've neutralized most contaminants that are in there. And as long as you don't open the lid, you're not introducing further contaminants. So there is no thing to then get introduced into your substrate while you're doing the work that requires clean work. And even the simple process of working adjacent to like a home air filter unit with a HEPA filter in it that's blowing fresh air in the direction of where you're working will improve your your success rate when working with these methods that require high levels of sterilization. And just to wrap up here, some common issues seen with mushroom cultivation is obvious mold or other contaminants like you see in the straw log right here. If you don't see that white mycelium taking off, like something is immediately wrong. Pockets of uncolonized substrate usually mean that bacteria has taken over or something else has created a zone that's already in competition. And then getting to the fruiting stage and lack of mushroom formation is usually just a result of not having the right parameters. There's very little reason why that you would get a fully colonized block that wouldn't produce mushrooms when given the right environment. And then aborted or malformed fruits usually mean that there's some type of bacteria in the room that you're fruiting in that you need to address in some way, or too much moisture can be an issue as well. And so here I just have some additional resources for learning. Mycelium Running, the book that I mentioned that I pulled that table from, written by Paul Stamets, is great. Organic Mushroom Farming and Microremediation by Trad Cotter is a little more on the level of people that have no experience and just want to do the bare basics. He describes all the methods that we've discussed today in great detail with a lot of photos and helpful things. Radical Mycology by Peter McCoy. NAMICO.org is the North American Mycological Association, and their website has a ton of information on mushrooms in general and a lot of low-tech cultivation methods. And then also April 23rd, Saturday, we will be hosting an on-farm mushroom workshop at Sunhands Farm that will go through all of these methods in a much more detailed and hands-on environment where everyone will go home with something already made that you can then learn to fruit. And the only other thing I would recommend is that if you really just want to learn about the mushroom processes, you can buy ready to grow at home kits through a lot of avenues online. We'll start to begin to offer them probably around farmers market season in May. And that just helps you kind of understand the process of fruiting mushrooms, which can be the most challenging, where, a lot of times you can get mycelium to grow, but learning the process of like, all right, things are fully colonized, it's ready to go into a fruiting environment, and how that fruiting environment needs to look is a lot of the struggle that beginning growers have, that getting over that hump really then just kind of sets you off on an arc where your learning curve just gets steeper and steeper and steeper. And so with that, I'd like to thank everybody for joining along on that workshop and open it up to general Q&A.
Okay, everyone. So we're going to start from the top and work our way down through any of the questions that were not answered during the presentation. TJ would like to know, is it best to source locally for spawn?
Yeah, I mean, that's ideal if you get it as close to the source, it's, as close to it being produced, then you don't have cold storage and times where it's sitting. Spawn starts to go downhill the second that it's fully ready to be used. So as fresh as possible is the best, yes.
And Cindy would like to know, do mushrooms have to be grown outdoors, or does it depend on your method?
No, anything that we discussed today, from pasteurized straw to supplemented sawdust, can be done indoors. It's just a matter of, are you willing to experiment with some potentially moldy things happening? If you do anything in those autoclavable filter patch bags, that prevents mold from getting out. But as my wife would tell you, there was many times where I came home and she had thrown stuff out because she didn't like it. And that's the risk that you run of, you're trying to grow mushrooms in an environment that mold loves. If you do it indoors, there is a chance that you will grow mold. And so you have to just stay on top of checking on things every so often to make sure you're not growing mold all throughout your house.
All right. And Andrea would like to know, will you be sharing nutritional value of mushrooms, or would you be able to share a source for that info?
Yeah, there's a lot of great workshops. I did one 3 years ago on the nutritional and medicinal benefits of mushrooms. I think that's still on the Free the Seeds YouTube page. And Paul Stamets' book that I mentioned right here, Mycelium Running, has some really great resources. All of these books have really great resources on the nutritional benefits of mushrooms. So I'll keep that up here so everybody can copy them down.
And Diane would like to know, does it matter if poplar or willow are hybrid?
No, that wouldn't matter. They're both basically a very similar species and fast decomposing.
And BS would like to know, how many harvests per plug?
So any substrate that you're using, any container, whatever you want to call it, of what you're going to fruit, you should get at least 3 flushes. So what happens is, something we probably should have discussed is, when you're cutting holes into your container, if you're doing pasteurized straw, you need to keep account for the fact that every amount of mycelium has an X% or X amount of fresh mushrooms it's going to produce based off of the dry weight that we talked about, the biological efficiency. So if you have more holes and more areas that mushrooms can form, it's going to form a lot more but smaller groups of mushrooms. If you have just one area that it's coming out of, it's going to form one giant cluster. And your first fruit is going to be your largest, hopefully, unless there's something going on where the growing conditions aren't ideal. And then every harvest after that is going to get decreasing, by like a factor of 3. And so it just gets to the point of, how much time do you want to let it sit around rather than just produce new stuff. But you should get at least 3 harvests out of every substrate that you start.
And Candace also would like to know, should you take the bark off the log or leave it on?
No, we want to leave that on because that's helping keep the humidity in, and not any area that's cut or drilled for the plug spawn, you're going to cover up with wax. So ideally, you should even cover the ends of the log with wax so that it keeps the humidity in and prevents it from drying out.
Does it matter what kind of wax you use to cover the inoculation in logs?
No, you'd want to use some kind of food grade wax, because then that's going to be in contact with the areas where the mushrooms are likely going to form out of. So if you use anything that has, any kind of toxic materials in it, then it might be in contact with the mushrooms as they form.
Melissa would like to know any suggestions for where to get hardwood chips in the flathead.
I've struggled with that quite a bit. I mean, there's occasionally people on Craigslist that are tree cutting services that will advertise that they have wood chips, but a lot of times they won't guarantee that it's going to be purely hardwood. So, I mean, outside of buying a chipper or something like that, I would recommend, if you can't find them, just stick with straw. It'll produce as much and probably faster.
Andrew would like to know, is the hot water pasteurization in addition to one of the prior options or a third option?
No, the hot water and the cold lime are 2 different ways to come to the same conclusion of pasteurization. And pasteurization is like a middle ground where wood chips and things like that were just introduced in spawn and hoping something happens. A step above that is pasteurization, where we're holding it 170 degrees, and that's killing off most of the competitors. And then like the highest success is sterilization, where you're hopefully killing all competitors, but they're all separate methods.
Susan would like to know, can you grow mushrooms outside near a water source, or does it have to be inside in a clean environment?
No, you can grow them outdoors. Like we said, when the substrate's fully colonized, it's very safe from competing molds. We've grown stuff in our high tunnels, greenhouses, just outdoors under like a shaded area and trees. The only issue is, you don't have as much control over the environment for fruiting when it's outdoors as when you bring it inside and, manipulate the environment to match what you want.
And Rachel would like to know, you said it uses up nitrogen. Would there still be enough for other plants to grow? Does it balance or use up the nitrogen?
That would depend. So if you were going to try to get it to remove nitrogen, it would consume enough that it needed to then fruit and then stop consuming it, hopefully. But what you would do is just apply the compost at a rate that's not excessive. Like if you put a ton of compost down and a lot of mycelium, then that mycelium is going to have a certain appetite for nitrogen. So you could potentially deplete a large chunk of what's there. So you would want to just balance like how much you're adding to the area. Like you would add it in a rate that you're adding just regular compost to your garden with the spent mushroom compost.
Susan kind of had a similar question. She would like to know, will oyster mushrooms take up all the nitrogen out of the soil or just balance it?
No, I mean, They will get to a point and then they'll fruit. And then that mycelium is pretty much done feeding to a certain level. So obviously you don't want to apply like an inch of mycelium to every square inch of your garden area. You want to apply it, pretty sparingly like you would. And it also has a nitrogen source in it too. If you're introducing it from spent substrate, there's nitrogen in the substrate still that wasn't eaten by the oysters. They'll then continue to kind of get processed, but it won't wipe everything out unless you over apply the material.
TK would like to know, do waste peanut hulls work in masters?
So master's mist is very specifically referring to soy hull. Soy hull has a very unique breakdown of fatty acids, protein, and low nitrogen. Whereas other hulls like cottonseed hulls, rice hulls, and peanut hulls have a different breakdown of that material. And if you, in Paul Stamets's book, he has a whole chapter, not mycelium running, but the mushroom cultivation handbook. He has a whole appendix that lists potential supplement mixtures and their protein, fat, nitrogen components. So if you can't get soy hulls, I would say do 80-20 with whatever you can get. 50-50 is only for soy hulls.
Keith would like to know, is Douglas fir an acceptable for sawdust, and is pine sawdust to be avoided?
What was the last one? Is what sawdust?
Is pine sawdust to be avoided?
I don't have as much experience with pine. I know other farms that have grown on loblolly pine. I would recommend Doug fir, just because it has the best the closest to a hardwood breakdown in terms of fiber and density. Most pines should work, but I imagine that there's probably some pines that wouldn't. But Doug fir, and that's readily available all throughout the Pacific Northwest.
Lana would like to know, how long does it take for mushrooms to fruit, and are there different expectations within a greenhouse?
Yeah, so again, our fruiting conditions and our temperature is going to kind of dictate how fast. Certain species definitely have different maturation rates, but most oysters in our environment, where we're keeping temperatures around 55 degrees, from the time that we introduce them to the grow room to their done fruiting is about 10 days. In the summer, when it gets up closer to 70 degrees, that can be as fast as 5 days. Other species grown on logs are going to have a much longer maturation period, where like shiitake takes at least 14 days. Lion's mane can take at least 2 weeks. Oysters are usually the fastest maturing, and they're just the most aggressive all over. But yeah, like we said, if your conditions are on the cooler side, it's going to take longer. If it's on the warmer side, it's going to go a lot faster.
And Candace would like to know, when using birch or logs, is it preferable to remove the bark?
We never want to remove the bark. That's going to rob moisture from the logs. We want to keep as much moisture in as we can.
Holly would like to know, can you use 0.5 micron filter bags to produce spawn, or do you have to use 0.2 micron filter bags?
So if you go on, we use 5 tea bags, which I believe are 0.5. Obviously, the smaller the part, the pore size, the better for spawn. You can do it at a larger size. You just have increased risk of contamination. If you're working in a cleaner environment, that shouldn't be an issue. And if you're doing sawdust spawn, that shouldn't be an issue at all. So you can use whatever bag you prefer there. But yeah, I mean, most of those bags are about the same price, whether you're using the 5T or I forget the other size. But if you go on to Mushroom Media online or Myers Mushrooms, I think they have some guidance on there as to what they recommend for spawn production.
Okay, everyone, you only have time for one more question. Amanda would like to know, if contamination is observed, is fruit from an uncontaminated area safe to harvest, or should the entire bag or container or bed be disposed of?
So the mushrooms are still safe, and we've fruited a lot of contaminated bags outdoors in greenhouses. So it's definitely safe to consume whatever comes off there. Obviously, you want to just trim off any obvious signs of mold or deformation. The risk is basically if you leave that contaminated bag in an indoor environment or an environment around other mushrooms, it's going to potentially spread that contamination to other parts of your grow that's not contaminated. So it's a risk reward kind of analysis of, do I want to take the risk of contaminating stuff that's not, gone wrong with, trying to save a couple pounds of fruit off of this one block.
All right. Well, thank you, Shawn, for that wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone else for joining us. And Shawn, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, just I really appreciate everybody taking time to join the workshop, and I'm always excited to see more people, interested in mushrooms. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions if anyone's local. We try to help growers out in any way possible on their journey of growing mushrooms at home, whether it's providing spawn or just some level of mentorship or questions that we can answer. Obviously, we have a business that we run, so we can't respond to everything in a timely manner, especially during the peak of the grow season. But we welcome any contact from anyone locally, especially, and come see us at farmers market if it's easier than ask us a few questions. Always happy to talk mushrooms.
And with that, thank you and have a great rest of the day.